Before you take another sip, put down your coffee for a moment. Just for a moment. I want you to look at it. That cup, whatever it is, paper cup from a drive-thru, ceramic mug on your desk, the espresso you pulled yourself at 6 in the morning before anyone else in the house was awake. Look at it. Because what is in that cup is not just a beverage. It is the end result of 1,000 years of smuggling, revolution, assassination attempts, religious prohibition, colonial exploitation, accidental discovery, deliberate theft, and the single most consequential shift in human cognitive productivity in the history of civilization.
Before coffee, Europe drank alcohol for breakfast. Not because Europeans were particularly fond of morning drinking, though some were, but because the water was not safe. Beer and wine were safer than water. So the default beverage of the working day, from morning to night across most of Europe for most of its history, was mildly alcoholic. Think about what that means for a moment. The architects who designed the cathedrals, the merchants who ran the trade routes, the scholars who copied the manuscripts, the judges who delivered verdicts, all of them operating on a baseline of mild, chronic inebriation. And then, coffee arrived, and the thinking changed. This is the story of how a plant that grew on a hillside in Ethiopia became the engine of the Enlightenment, the fuel of the Industrial Revolution, the social lubricant of the information economy, and the most widely consumed psychoactive substance in human history. It is also the story of the people who discovered it, fought over it, banned it, smuggled it, and built empires around it, and the people those empires destroyed in the process of building them. All of that in your cup. Let us begin. Part 1. The Goats of Ethiopia, 850 to 1000 CE. The origin story of coffee begins, as the best origin stories do, with an observation that nobody was supposed to make. The legend, and I want to be honest that it is a legend, a story that accumulated around the discovery long after the discovery happened, goes like this. A goat herder named Kaldi was tending his flock on the highlands of Ethiopia, in a region called Kaffa, sometime around 850 CE. He noticed something unusual about his goats. They had eaten the berries of a certain tree, a tree with dark green leaves and small red fruit, and they would not sleep that night. They danced, the legend says. They were energized and restless and entirely unwilling to settle into their normal evening calm. Kaldi, curious, brought the berries to a local monastery. The monks, interested in anything that might help them stay awake through the long hours of evening prayer, made a drink from the berries and found that it worked. Whether Kaldi actually existed, whether the goats actually danced, whether the monks were the first to recognize the berries' properties, none of this can be verified. The story is too neat, too convenient, too perfectly shaped around the properties of the plant it explains. But here is what is not legend. The Ethiopian highlands are the original home of Coffea arabica, the species of plant from which all the world's coffee originates. It grew there wild, in the forests of what is now the Kaffa region of southwestern Ethiopia, for thousands of years before any human being understood what it could do. The people of the region had been using the plant in various ways for centuries before the drink we recognize as coffee was developed. Coffee leaves were chewed, coffee berries were crushed and mixed with animal fat into a kind of energy ball, a portable stimulant that travelers and warriors carried on long journeys. The fruit pulp was fermented into a mild alcoholic beverage called quiche. What nobody had yet done was roast the bean inside the berry, grind it, and brew it in hot water. That step
The step that created coffee as we know it came later, in Yemen. And the path from the Ethiopian highlands to the Yemeni port of Mocha is the first great journey in the history of coffee.
The Sufi Muslims of Yemen are generally credited with developing the roasted brewed beverage in approximately the 15th century. The connection makes sense. Sufi orders were known for extended nighttime devotional practices, dhikr, the rhythmic chanting and prayer that could last all night, and a beverage that kept practitioners awake and mentally alert was an obvious asset. The drink they developed, kahwa in Arabic, a word that originally referred to wine and was transferred to coffee as a kind of honorific, spread rapidly through Sufi networks across the Islamic world. From Yemen to Mecca, from Mecca to Cairo, from Cairo to Istanbul.
The speed of coffee's spread through the Islamic world in the 15th and early 16th centuries is one of the first indications of what the substance actually was. Not just a pleasant drink, but a genuine performance enhancer, adopted enthusiastically by any group whose productivity depended on sustained mental alertness. Scholars and students adopted it, merchants adopted it, government officials adopted it, the military adopted it. Coffee spread because it worked, and it worked in a way that was immediately, practically obvious to anyone who tried it. It also spread because of what it created, the coffee house.
The first coffee houses appeared in Mecca and Medina in approximately 1511. They spread to Cairo by 1532, to Istanbul by 1554, to Damascus and Aleppo and Baghdad through the second half of the 16th century. By 1600, the coffee house was an established institution across the Islamic world, a social and commercial and intellectual space unlike anything that had existed before. The coffee house was, in its original form, a public space where men could gather, drink coffee, play chess, listen to music, exchange news and gossip, conduct business, and debate theology and politics. It was not a tavern. Alcohol was not served. It was not a mosque. Religion was not the primary activity. It was something genuinely new, a secular public space for social and intellectual exchange. The consequences of this institution were significant and almost immediately recognized as such, not always positively.
Part 2. The First Ban. In 1511, the governor of Mecca was a man named Khair Beg. Khair Beg had a problem. People were gathering in coffee houses and talking. They were talking about politics, about religion, about governance. They were, in the specific way that people who are alert and gathered in groups tend to do, generating opinions about everything, including about Khair Beg himself. He convened a council of legal scholars and physicians to examine the question of whether coffee was permissible under Islamic law. The physicians testified that coffee was harmful to health. The legal scholars debated whether a substance that altered the mind, even pleasantly, even productively, fell under the Quranic prohibition on intoxicants. Khair Beg declared coffee prohibited. The coffee houses of Mecca were closed. Coffee supplies in the city were seized and burned. The ban lasted approximately 1 year.
It was overturned by the Sultan of Egypt, who correctly identified Khair Beg's motivations as political rather than religious or medical, and who liked coffee himself. The coffee houses reopened. Khair Beg was removed from his position shortly afterward. This first coffee ban established a pattern that would repeat itself across multiple cultures over the next 2 centuries. Coffee would be banned. The ban would be unenforceable because the population simply refused to stop drinking it, and the ban would eventually be lifted. The sequence would occur in Mecca, Cairo, Istanbul, England, Prussia, and Sweden, each time with the same result. You cannot ban something that works this well. The Ottoman Empire's relationship with coffee is one of the most interesting chapters in the beverage's history. Coffee arrived in Istanbul in the 1550s and within a decade had transformed the social life of the imperial capital. By 1570, there were more than 600 coffeehouses in Istanbul. They had become the central institution of Ottoman public life, the place where merchants made deals, scholars debated, poets recited, musicians performed, and ordinary citizens spent their leisure hours. The Ottoman coffeehouses were remarkably democratic spaces by the standards of the era. A merchant and a porter could sit at adjacent tables. A scholar and a soldier could debate over the same cups. The social leveling that coffee and the coffeehouse produced was genuinely unusual in an era of rigid social hierarchy.
Sultan Murad IV, the same sultan who watched Hezarfen Ahmed Chalabi fly across the Bosporus, the same sultan who had the inventor exiled to Algeria, banned coffee in 1633, and tobacco, and wine, on pain of death. He reportedly enforced the coffee ban personally. He walked the streets of Istanbul in disguise, and if he found someone drinking coffee, the punishment was summary execution. Contemporary accounts describe him as taking this duty seriously. The ban did not work. People continued to drink coffee in secret. When Murad IV died in 1640, the ban died with him, and the coffee houses reopened immediately. Sultan Murad IV was, among his many attributes, a man who could not stop his own population from drinking coffee. He is not alone in history in this particular failure.
Part 3. Coffee crosses to Europe, 1600 to 1650. The story of how coffee reached Europe is, like most stories of cultural transmission across the Mediterranean in this period, a story about trade routes and merchants, and the specific human impulse to carry useful things from one place to another. Venetian merchants were among the first Europeans to encounter coffee, through their extensive trading contacts with the Ottoman Empire. By 1570 or so, coffee was being imported into Venice in small quantities, traded as an exotic commodity, consumed initially by the wealthy and the curious. Pope Clement VIII was presented with coffee sometime around 1600, reportedly by advisors who wanted him to ban it, a substance of Muslim origin, consumed throughout the Islamic world, potentially a threat to Christian values, in ways his advisors could not entirely articulate, but felt strongly about.
The Pope tasted it. He reportedly said that it would be a pity to let the devil have all the best drinks, and that it should be baptized, meaning declared permissible for Christians. Whether this story is entirely accurate is uncertain. What is certain is that the Catholic Church did not ban coffee, and that without papal prohibition, the beverage spread through Catholic Europe with considerable speed. The first coffee house in England opened in Oxford in 1650. It was opened by a man named Jacob, described in contemporary accounts as a Jewish man from Lebanon or Turkey, which speaks to the trading networks through which coffee traveled. The Oxford Coffee House quickly became a center for the kind of intellectual exchange that characterized its Ottoman predecessors. Within 2 years, a coffee house had opened in London. Within a decade, there were dozens. By the 1660s, there were hundreds. By the early 18th century, London had more than 2,000 coffee houses. The English coffee house was, in its social function, remarkably similar to its Ottoman predecessor, a public space for conversation, debate, news exchange, and business. The price of entry, 1 penny for a cup of coffee, gave the institution its common name, the Penny University. For a penny, any man could sit for hours, read the newspapers provided, listen to the conversations around him, and participate in the intellectual life of the city. The Penny University deserves more credit than it receives in standard histories of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, the period of European intellectual history characterized by emphasis on reason, scientific inquiry, individual rights, and skepticism of traditional authority, emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries. Its primary institutions were the scientific society, the salon, and the coffee house. The coffee house has received the least attention of the three, and possibly did the most work. The Royal Society of London, the premier scientific institution of the era, which counted Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, and Christopher Wren among its members, held its early meetings in coffee houses.
The insurance market Lloyd's of London grew out of Edward Lloyd's coffee house, where merchants and ship owners gathered to share information and make deals. The London Stock Exchange developed from Jonathan's coffee house in Exchange Alley. The pattern was consistent. Coffee houses provided the space and the social conditions for the exchange of information and the development of ideas. The alertness and sociability that coffee produced made those exchanges more productive. Part 4. The Women's Petition and the English Ban, 1674. In 1674, a group of London women published a document called the Women's Petition Against Coffee. It is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of the beverage and deserves to be read in full, which I will not do here because the language is 17th century and requires patience, but whose essential argument was this: coffee was making their husbands useless. Not intellectually. The women had no objection to intellectual stimulation. The specific complaint was physiological. The petitioners argued that coffee, by some mechanism they did not fully understand, was rendering English men incapable of performing their marital duties. They called coffee a base, black, thick, nasty, bitter, stinking puddle water. They argued that since men began drinking it, the nation had produced fewer children. The petition was met with a counter-petition from the men, who defended their right to coffee and their ability to perform all relevant duties. King Charles II, who had his own political reasons for wanting to close the coffee houses, they were hotbeds of political opposition to the monarchy, attempted to ban them in 1675, citing their role in spreading seditious and defamatory publications against the government. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Within 11 days, Charles II withdrew the proclamation. The coffee houses stayed open. The petitioners argued that coffee, by some mechanism they did not fully understand, was rendering English men incapable of performing their marital duties. They called coffee a base, black, thick, nasty, bitter, stinking puddle water. They argued that since men began drinking it, the nation had produced fewer children. The petition was met with a counter-petition from the men, who defended their right to coffee and their ability to perform all relevant duties. King Charles II, who had his own political reasons for wanting to close the coffee houses, they were hotbeds of political opposition to the monarchy, attempted to ban them in 1675, citing their role in spreading seditious and defamatory publications against the government. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Within 11 days, Charles II withdrew the proclamation. The coffee houses stayed open.
The Women's Petition Against Coffee is funny. It is also historically revealing. It documents in its particular complaint the degree to which coffee houses had become male-dominated spaces in England in a way that their Ottoman predecessors had also been. Women in England did not generally go to coffee houses. The institution was male, and the complaints of the women excluded from it were redirected in the petition into concerns about their husbands' availability at home. The gender politics of the coffee house are complicated and not uniformly positive. The same institution that democratized intellectual exchange among men simultaneously excluded women from that exchange.
Part 5. The Smuggled Seed and the Colonial Plantation, 1600 to 1800. For most of the 17th century, the Arab world maintained a near monopoly on coffee production. The port of Mocha in Yemen, from which the word mocha derives, was the primary export point for coffee beans, and the Arab traders who controlled the port took precautions to ensure that no viable coffee plant or seed left Yemen. Coffee beans exported through Mocha were apparently treated to prevent germination, roasted or boiled before export, ensuring that the product could be consumed but not cultivated elsewhere. This monopoly was broken by a man named Baba Budan. Baba Budan was an Indian Muslim pilgrim who traveled to Mecca on the Hajj in approximately 1600. In Mocha, on his return journey, he smuggled out 7 coffee seeds, concealed, the legend says, in his beard. He carried them back to the Chikmagalur district of Karnataka in southern India and planted them on a hillside there. Those 7 seeds, if the story is accurate, were the origin of coffee cultivation outside the Arabian Peninsula. From the Chikmagalur Hills, coffee cultivation spread through India and eventually to the Dutch colonies of Ceylon and Java. The Dutch were the European power most aggressively interested in breaking the Arab coffee monopoly. They obtained coffee plants through their colonial networks in the early 17th century and established coffee plantations on Java, which is why coffee is still sometimes called Java, and in their Caribbean colonies. Then the French entered the story, and the story became both more romantic and considerably darker. Gabriel de Clieu was a French naval officer serving in the Caribbean colony of Martinique in the early 18th century. He wanted to bring coffee cultivation to Martinique, and to do so, he needed a coffee plant. In 1723, he obtained, through means that involve either the gift of a sympathetic noblewoman or outright theft, depending on which account you believe, a single coffee plant from the Royal Botanical Gardens in Paris. He carried it across the Atlantic on a ship. The voyage was, by his own account, eventful. The plant was nearly destroyed by a fellow passenger who was apparently a spy for Dutch coffee interests. A storm nearly washed it overboard. In a period of water shortage, de Clieu shared his own water ration with the plant to keep it alive. He got it to Martinique. He planted it. He protected it with, by some accounts, an armed guard. It grew. Within 50 years, Martinique had 18 million coffee trees, all descended from that single plant. From Martinique, coffee cultivation spread through the French Caribbean colonies, and then to Brazil, which eventually became, and remains today, the largest coffee-producing country in the world. The Brazilian coffee industry was built on enslaved labor. This is the part of coffee's history that the Romantic origin stories consistently elide. The expansion of coffee cultivation from the Arab world into European colonial plantations in the 17th and 18th centuries was powered by one of the most brutal labor systems in human history. In Brazil, in the Caribbean, in the Dutch East Indies, coffee plantations depended on enslaved African workers, and later exploited indentured laborers from South and Southeast Asia. The democratizing beverage that fueled the Enlightenment's discussions of human rights and liberty was produced, for a significant portion of its history, by enslaved and exploited human beings. That contradiction between what coffee enabled in the coffeehouses of London and Paris and Boston, and what coffee production required on the plantations of Brazil and Martinique, is not a footnote to the history of coffee. It is central to it. Part 6. Boston, Revolution, and the Cup That Changed a Nation, 1773. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of American colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded 3 British ships in Boston Harbor and threw 342 chests of East India Company tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party is one of the most famous acts of political protest in American history. It is also, in the context of this story, a coffee story. The American colonists' rejection of British tea, the Tea Tax, the Tea Act, the East India Company's monopoly was simultaneously a political act and a cultural shift. Tea had been the dominant beverage in the American colonies. After the Boston Tea Party, drinking tea became politically suspect, an act of loyalty to the British Crown. Patriotic Americans switched to coffee.
John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail that he was determined to give up tea entirely and drink coffee instead, however disagreeable he found it at first, because it was the duty of a patriot. This cultural shift from a tea-drinking to a coffee-drinking nation happened in a specific political moment and stuck. The United States became, and remains, one of the largest coffee-consuming nations in the world, partly because of a tax dispute in 1773.
The coffee house had already played a significant role in the American Revolution before the Boston Tea Party. The Green Dragon Tavern in Boston, which served coffee as well as alcohol, was a regular meeting place for the Sons of Liberty, the revolutionary organization that planned the resistance to British rule. Paul Revere was a regular. John Adams was a regular. The meetings that planned the revolution happened in significant part over coffee. The revolution that produced the world's most powerful democracy was planned in coffee houses. Part 7. The Enlightenment's Engine, the Industrial Fuel, 1700 to 1900. By the 18th century, coffee had thoroughly displaced alcohol as the beverage of the working day in most of Europe and the American colonies. This displacement, from mild daily inebriation to daily stimulation, is one of the most significant and least discussed shifts in the productive capacity of human civilization. Consider what changed. An artisan who previously spent his working day on a baseline of mild alcoholic impairment now spent it on a baseline of caffeine-enhanced alertness. A merchant who previously conducted his affairs through a haze of morning ale now conducted them with the focused attention that coffee produced. A scholar who previously dozed over manuscripts now read with the specific coffee-enhanced intensity that anyone who is written under deadline will recognize. The aggregate effect of this shift across an entire civilization is impossible to calculate precisely and almost certainly enormous. The Industrial Revolution, the period of rapid technological and economic change that began in Britain in approximately 1760 and spread through Europe and North America over the following century, required something that agricultural economies had not required in the same way: sustained, precise, repetitive cognitive and physical labor performed reliably on schedule for extended periods. The factory system demanded workers who arrived on time, paid attention, and maintained consistent performance through long shifts. The management systems that developed to run factories required administrators and engineers and accountants who could process information accurately and make decisions under pressure. Coffee was not the only factor in making the Industrial Revolution possible, but a civilization that had switched from morning ale to morning coffee was significantly better equipped for the cognitive demands of industrial work than one that had not. The specific productivity enhancement of caffeine, increased alertness, improved concentration, faster processing of information, reduced fatigue, mapped onto the demands of the industrial economy with remarkable precision. The timing was not coincidental. Coffee availability and industrial development advanced together through the same trade networks funded by the same colonial economic system.
Johann Sebastian Bach wrote a comic cantata about coffee in 1732. The coffee cantata, Schweigt stille, plaudert nicht. A father argues with his daughter about her excessive coffee consumption. She refuses to give it up. She sings famously that coffee is lovelier than 1,000 kisses. Bach was not writing satire from outside the culture of coffee. He was writing from inside it. A man who drank it, who understood the specific pleasure and the specific dependency it produced.
who found the cultural argument about it funny because he had observed it in his own life.
Coffee had, by 1732, become sufficiently embedded in European culture that a major composer could write a comic piece about addiction to it and expect audiences to find it immediately relatable. That embeddedness, the degree to which coffee had become not just a beverage, but a cultural institution, a social ritual, a daily necessity, is the measure of how completely and how quickly it had transformed the cultures it entered. Part 8. The Coffee Industry's Dark Mirror, 1800 to 1950. The story of coffee's global expansion in the 19th century is inseparable from the story of colonialism, and the attempt to tell it without that inseparability is a distortion. Brazil became the world's dominant coffee producer in the early 19th century, and Brazilian coffee production was initially built almost entirely on enslaved labor. The coffee fazendas, the great plantation estates of Sao Paulo and Minas Gerais, required enormous workforces for planting, harvesting, and processing. That workforce was provided, until Brazilian abolition in 1888, by enslaved Africans. Brazil's coffee economy and Brazil's slave economy were not parallel industries. They were the same industry. The coffee that fueled European Enlightenment discussions of human liberty was produced by people who had none. After Brazilian abolition, the labor system shifted rather than transformed. Italian, Japanese, and Spanish immigrant workers arrived under contract systems that were, in practice, barely distinguishable from indentured servitude. The conditions on coffee plantations, the housing, the hours, the pay, the debt bondage that kept workers tied to specific estates were documented by labor investigators and journalists in terms that made the improvement from enslaved labor seem modest. In the Belgian Congo, where coffee cultivation was one of the industries that King Leopold II exploited through his private colonial regime, the methods of labor extraction were simply violent. Workers who failed to meet production quotas faced mutilation and death. The international outcry over Leopold's Congo, driven significantly by the journalism of Edmund Morel and the diplomatic reporting of Roger Casement, is one of the first modern human rights campaigns, and coffee production was among the industries at its center. The comfortable morning cup of the European bourgeoisie and the violence of the colonial plantation were not separate stories. They were the same story, told from different ends. Part 9. The 20th Century and the Democratization of Coffee, 1900 to present. The 20th century did two things to coffee simultaneously. It made it cheaper and more accessible than it had ever been, and it made it, for a significant period in the middle of the century, considerably worse. The development of commercial coffee roasting and blending at industrial scale, beginning in the late 19th century with companies like Folgers and Maxwell House, produced coffee that was stable, affordable, and widely available. It also produced coffee that prioritized shelf life and cost efficiency over flavor. The Robusta bean, a species of coffee with higher caffeine content, but significantly less nuanced flavor than Arabica, was blended into commercial products because it was cheaper and easier to grow. The result was the specific, bitter, thin, vaguely metallic coffee that became the standard American office and diner experience for most of the 20th century. The vacuum can, the percolator, the instant coffee. Each technological development extended coffee's shelf life and accessibility, and did something to its quality that the people who had experienced the coffeehouses of 17th century Istanbul would have found unrecognizable. This deterioration was reversed, beginning in the 1960s and accelerating through the 1980s and beyond, by what coffee historians call the specialty coffee movement. Alfred Peet was a Dutch immigrant who opened a coffee shop in Berkeley, California in 1966, Peet's Coffee, that sold freshly roasted, high-quality Arabica beans to customers who wanted something better than canned commercial blends. His approach to sourcing and roasting influenced a generation of coffee entrepreneurs, including the founders of a small Seattle coffee company called Starbucks. Howard Schultz joined Starbucks in 1982, traveled to Italy, experienced the espresso culture of Milan and Verona, and returned to America with the intention of recreating it. The Starbucks expansion of the 1990s brought espresso-based drinks to American mass-market consumers on a scale that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. The specialty coffee movement that followed, the third wave as it came to be called, distinguishing it from the first wave of commercial canning and the second wave of Starbucks-style accessible espresso, pushed quality, sourcing transparency, and brewing technique to levels that genuinely rivaled the best coffee of any previous era. Single origin beans, precise roasting profiles, pour-over brewing, sustainable sourcing relationships with specific farms. The third wave coffeehouse of the 2010s was, in its intellectual engagement with its product and its role as a social and commercial space, more similar to the Ottoman coffeehouse of the 1500s than to the canned coffee dispensary of the 1950s. The wheel, in some ways, had come full circle. So, put your coffee back down for one more moment. You picked it up this morning, or this afternoon, or whenever you were listening to this, as an act so automatic that you probably did not think about it at all. The alarm went off, you made coffee, you drank it, the day began. What you were actually doing in that automatic gesture was participating in one of the longest-running and most consequential cultural traditions in human history. You were drinking something that a goat herder may or may not have noticed his goats eating in the Ethiopian highlands 1,200 years ago. That Sufi monks in Yemen developed into a brewed drink to help them pray through the night. That spread through the Islamic world in decades and was banned and unbanned and banned again by rulers who correctly identified it as a substance that made people think more clearly, which is threatening if you prefer they don't. You are drinking something that crossed the Mediterranean in Venetian trading ships, was presented to a pope who decided to baptize it rather than ban it, and opened the intellectual spaces where the Enlightenment was argued into existence. You were drinking something that American revolutionaries switched to from tea as an act of political protest that fueled the Industrial Revolution's workforce, that was produced for centuries by enslaved and exploited human beings whose names the history books did not record. You were drinking something that a Dutch immigrant brought to Berkeley in 1966, and that a Seattle entrepreneur scaled into a global phenomenon that put an espresso machine in every airport in the world. All of that in one cup. The history of coffee is not a minor history. It is a lens through which you can see almost everything important that happened in the last 1,000 years of human civilization. The trade routes, revolutions, the colonialism and the Enlightenment, the democratization of intellectual life, and the exploitation of agricultural labor. The human need for both stimulation and sociability, and the remarkable fact that one plant discovered on an Ethiopian hillside has been providing both for over a millennium. The next time someone asks you why you drink coffee, you can tell them it is because you are continuing a tradition that helped build the modern world. Or you can just tell them you like it. Both are true. Now, drink your coffee. It is getting cold.